Okay, good afternoon all. A very big welcome to this webinar about research capacity building hosted by the NIHR School for Social Care Research. My name's Paul Willis. I'm an Associate Professor in Social Work in the School for Policy Studies and the Centre for Research in Health and Social Care at the University of Bristol. And we're delighted that you're able to join us today. So today's webinar is going to focus on an introduction to mixed methods research. And I'm very delighted to welcome as our guest presenter, Professor Joy Adamson. Professor Adamson is a chair of surgical trials and health sciences at the University of York and formerly known as part of social medicine at the University of Bristol. Joy, a very big welcome.
Thank you.
So just a comment on the structure for today. Joy is going to present for around about 40-45 minutes. And then we'll pause for some questions with Joy for the last 10-15 minutes of the webinar. So everybody's on mute. And what I would ask people to do, as you have questions throughout Joy's presentation, if you could just pop those in the chat box to everybody, and we'll keep an eye on that and note down the questions. And then we'll invite people to ask their questions, or I can put questions to Joy on your behalf. So Joy, yeah, as someone who's had mixed success with mixed method studies, I'm really curious to hear your insights based on your experiences of managing this kind of research design and these kind of studies. So I'll hand over to you. Thanks, Joy.
Thank you very much, Paul. Yeah, Yvonne asked me to do this webinar today on mixed methods. Now, I'm not claiming to be any great authority on it, but I have dabbled in mixed methods for around about the last 20 years. And so whilst I'm sort of not feeling like I'm probably doing it any better than any of you lot, I'm very happy to share with you my experiences of the kind of things that I've done and what I've found useful and less useful. So I'd be really interested to hear your experiences and your questions at the end. I just wanted to start by just telling you a little bit about myself and how I started out in mixed methods. I mean, I guess probably, I think my career has gone along in parallel with the development of mixed methods, because I started out in applied health research around about the time when mixed methods was really sort of kicking off in terms of there was much more increased interest in taking a mixed methods approach, and they started to train people in order to sort of be able to, do mixed methods. And so from that point of view, at the time, at the start, of my career, it was fairly unusual in that I had done a PhD in qualitative methods, as well as an MSc in epidemiology. So I did have sort of formal training in both methods. And I think the idea was then, if you sort of had formal training in both, that then as if by magic, you would be able to do the mixed methods bit. Now that, I don't know if that's actually happened, but, but I suppose at least it put us on the right foot, that I felt like I was someone who was equally sort of familiar with both sort of methods. I felt equally comfortable. But I suppose most importantly, I saw the value in both sorts of methods, because sometimes as part of a multidisciplinary team, that isn't sort of always the case. And so that's where I started from anyway. And I've used them in my role as an applied health researcher over a number of years. In particular, at the minute, I work in the trials unit. So we do large pragmatic RCTs of mostly complex interventions. So, for example, I've been doing work in the more recent years around complex interventions for falls prevention. And I'm hoping, because of the type of applied health research that I do, that much of what I will say will equally apply to researching sort of issues around social care as well. I think the methodological issues are very similar across both of these sorts of disciplines. So that's where I'm coming from. Just in terms of what I thought I would do today, is sort of give a brief overview about what I mean, and I think what we have as the shared meaning of mixed methods research. Talk through some of the issues about why we might be interested in taking a mixed methods approach, what sort of issues around designing do we need to think about, and I suppose really importantly, in the second half of the presentation will be on this, we'll be concentrating on examples of this, is what we actually do with the data. How do we bring these two different sorts of methods together? And then right at the very end, I'll talk about some of the challenges and complexities, because I guess you'll all be aware that we don't kind of like conduct our research in a social bubble. There's a lot of politics and teamwork and sort of other political issues and sort of that come into our research, as well as the methodology, which I'd just like to touch upon briefly, because I think it can be quite important for mixed methods research. So that's the kind of things I'm going to talk about. So kind of, so to start off with then, what do we actually mean by mixed methods research? I've put this slide in for completeness because I felt like it was a bit naked without mentioning qualitative and quantitative research, you know, sort of as phenomenon in their own right. But I won't dwell on this too much. You're all very familiar with the most common paradigms. I just wanted to mention it just to remind ourselves that these come from different philosophical underpinnings about what we think about as reality and what can be studied. And I just thought I'd highlight that now because I think it's important just to mention briefly then what we think the philosophical underpinnings of mixed methods research might be. But I just wanted to remind us about the sort of the different nature of the types of research and the different sorts of questions that qualitative and quantitative research are trying to answer, just so we've got that in mind before we start to think about mixed methods research. We all know, especially in sort of health and social care, that kind of the research landscape is complex and messy. And it's not always the case that we think some of the questions that we want to answer can be dealt with by quantitative or qualitative research alone. And that's why we sort of sometimes want to understand some of the mechanisms around interventions and explaining what's going on. So for argument's sake, sort of a project that I'm working on at the minute is the use of early warning systems that were devised in secondary care based on clinical measurements. For example, the news score, about using that in care home environments in order to detect changes in somebody in a care home early so appropriate action can be taken. So of course, we've got quantitative data to look at that in terms of how the news is used, the frequency, about, you know, kind of things like hospital admissions, those kinds of quantitative data. But equally important to us are issues around how care homes feel about using early warning scores with their residents, how they actually do that in practice, what are the barriers and the facilitators, what are the challenges and what are the perceived benefits around that. So it's just to give an example of something I'm working on currently, where we're taking a mixed methods approach. So essentially, in terms of definition, and I think it's quite important, I mean, I may be sort of like preaching to the converted here, but mixed methods investigations involve the integration of quantitative and qualitative data collection and analysis within a single study. And I suppose I just want to emphasize the point of the integration. And I want to try and make a point that sort of mixed methods, as certainly as I see them, and I think the definition that is most commonly used, is around this integration as a sort of as an extra thing on top of the two strands of the research on their own. And that differentiates it from studies that you might rather call multi-method, where you do quant and qual, but you keep them in their sort of separate methodological silos, if you like. So I just wanted to sort of make sure that we're on the same page about that's what I mean. It's about the integration. And that's why a lot of the presentation concentrates on that aspect of it. So just two very brief words then on the philosophical underpinnings. I think if you're really a purist in methodological terms, you would find it difficult to conceive of the fact that you can actually mix methods that come from very different sort of philosophical starting points like positivism or constructivism and actually bring those together. There's something that just feels innately wrong to some people around that. However, people who are starting to use the mixed methods approach think of the underpinnings much more in terms of mostly sort of two different concepts. The first is that people often use Hammersley's subtle realism to justify their mixed methods approach in the sense that we think phenomena do exist independently of research claims, and there's different realities which can be reflected by the quantitative and the qualitative techniques. So that's one. And the other, again, I'll just mention very briefly, and I think actually seems to be used more commonly in applied health research, certainly, is the idea of pragmatism, is that we have a practical applied question to answer, and we choose our methods from this enlarged toolkit that we have, mixed methods being one of those tools, to address the question at hand. And as long as we do those methods with rigour and in a way that is reflexive, then it's that pragmatic approach that people will justify as their theoretical underpinnings. So that's what I'm going to say about that. So I'm going to start to think now a little bit about, well, okay, we're on board with the idea of a mixed method study. What might we want to consider when we're planning that? So certainly in my mind, when we're starting to plan any sort of evaluation or study type, I like to consider all methods. And it may be that we decide as we go along the road that some of them aren't appropriate, but I think we should consider them all, and in this case as well, include mixed methods as distinct from quant and qual, as you might do them separately. So why would we use mixed methods then? And these are the kind of instances or the sort of examples of when we would normally think about taking this approach. Sometimes qualitative research is used to sort of generate hypotheses or provide information on which you can base a kind of like a questionnaire design. Sometimes quantitative research is used to identify a qualitative sample. We might want the qualitative works to explain some of the quantitative findings that we have. It's particularly the case if these maybe are unexpected or not what we sort of thought might be the case at the outset. And also the issue of triangulation. Now I've put this in sort of, kind of commas because triangulation traditionally sort of tends to mean that you're going to use one method to essentially sort of verify the findings from another, and that somehow this will make the research more valid if both of those different types of research come up with the same sort of answer, if you like. And whilst that can be a legitimate thing to do, in mixed methods, we certainly have more of an appreciation of the fact that actually sometimes the research is going to find differences between those two different types of, the findings that come from those two different types of research. And that equally is fine. It isn't always about confirming, sometimes it's about using the different types of data to give a more sort of complete picture or a complete overview of the topic that we're interested in. So John Creswell, who in my mind is one of the gurus of mixed methods research, who's based in the States, has sort of come up with sort of 4 useful questions to think about when you're starting to plan and design a mixed method study around what is the sequence of your data collection, has either of the data collection types got a priority over the other, when will you actually do your data integration, and have you got an overall theoretical perspective? So those are the kind of questions, sort of he would say, start to think about them, and they're quite useful. So that's developed then into what he calls mixed method typologies. Now, these are not the only typologies. There's quite a lot of different ones that are sort of like have been developed over the years. But I find these ones are the ones that tend to be sort of used the most. So I just thought I'd give you a brief idea into, what these are. And like we've said, it's about the sequence. So here we've got sequential, either explanatory or exploratory strategies, or sequential in some sort of transformatory way, in the fact that you may be taking a sort of a feminist perspective for argument's sake, and actually that you're tied to a theoretical position for your integration. So as well as sequential, we can also do the work, the different strands concurrently. So we can do concurrent triangulations, I've just mentioned, either to validate or to set off the methodological weaknesses of either sorts of the studies on their own. We can sometimes do a nested strategy. And I find sort of certainly in the world of RCTs, we do more nested studies where basically we have the large quantitative RCT, we may do a smaller nested qualitative study, something around recruitment to trials, or something about acceptability of the intervention, or something about implementation. But that does offer us mixed methods opportunities as well as in a multi-method way. And as before, we can do concurrent transformative work as well. So I just wanted to give you a sense of one of the typologies. And I suppose these were developed to try and give some legitimacy to an emerging field. So people, sort of when you're doing research sometimes, and I think sometimes reviewers kind of want you to have a reference for something that you're, that you're doing. And it may be that, you'll be doing these sort of things anyway, but if you can sort of somehow say, okay, well, I'm using the concurrent nested strategy, it sort of helps to give you a bit more methodological clout if you want. But again, you know, kind of these aren't exclusive, and, you know, kind of they can be taken with a pinch of salt. So your key considerations then are sort of what is the purpose of your research? And then once you've got the purpose, you can start to think about how you bring the different sort of strands together. Then thinking about the timing and the sequencing of the different methods. I've gone through sequential and concurrent, but also I want to point out that this can also be iterative. It may be that you start out with some qualitative research to develop a questionnaire, which then is kind of analysed quantitatively once the questionnaire is put out. And then it may be that you go back to qualitative research to help to find some explanations for some of your quantitative answers. So there's lots of different sort of ways. I mean, and one of the points I wanted to make is, you know, you'll notice here on this slide, quant and quali in capitals or small letters, and that's meant to sort of that's how the dominance of which method is represented when it's written down as sort of, you know, kind of, if qual's in capital, that's the dominant method, and vice versa. So just a bit about, you know, sort of some conventions there. And you'll see that in particularly things like the Journal of Mixed Method Research, where they use these typologies and these, I suppose, these sort of systems more than you might find in some other journals. So again, which has got the priority. And of course, it's kind of important to think about, has it, you know, which method has got equal status? And I think that often depends on the question and of course the team that you're working within. So then finally, sort of the real key consideration in my mind is this issue of integration. What we're going to integrate, where we're going to do this integration, the extent of it, but really importantly, what is going to be the yield from this additional piece of work which involves integration over and above having the two methods sitting separately in their own silos. So I just wanted to sort of mention this point, but also again, it's another terminology that you might come across, is that we're really interested in this interaction between the qualitative and quantitative components, and that we can somehow get some unique insights, or the term meta-inferences can often be used, which I suppose in my mind is just that sort of higher order insight into the topic at hand that would get over and above the sort of studies taken independently. So it's sort of like the sum being great, you know, the whole being greater than the sum of its parts, essentially. How we detect that can be quite tricky, I think, but that's one of the things that we're trying to aim for. However, sort of one of the problems with that, and I think it was a problem, you know, sort of when the methods were more in their infancy, but still remains a problem, I think, certainly reflected in the literature that I've seen, that how we do that integration process can still be sort of a bit, you know, kind of a bit vague and a bit sort of difficult to find good examples on which we can base our own work. It's still a bit sort of kind of black boxy sometimes, and I think people are getting better at writing papers to describe that method, and some of which I'll sort of, you know, kind of will give some examples from. But, you know, kind of, but there's still lots of scope for people to use the examples that are out there, but also be innovative in thinking about how they might want to bring their methods together. But if you do that, I would certainly say, please report that in the methodological literature. It's probably going to go in that pile of papers that are really good ideas, but I never got around to writing, but if you can write that sort of thing, it can be really useful, just so that other researchers have got some examples to go off and, you know, kind of, and to learn from, you know, kind of like be brave with the good and bad experiences. So essentially now then, I'm going to talk you through various techniques of integration, some of which I've done myself, some of which I found in the literature that I think you might find useful to give a try. So that's sort of what I'm going to talk about next. I'll just grab a quick drink. Okay. So integration can happen then, I suppose, largely in two phases of the research process. Sometimes it happens at the analysis phase, and I'm going to talk about two methods there, which are one called following a thread and using a mixed methods matrix, or they can happen at the interpretation phase, and a triangulation protocol is an example of that. whether something's happening at the analysis phase or the interpretation phase can sometimes be a bit tricky to distinguish between, and so there's a little bit of blurring that can go on there. So I wouldn't worry too much about making that exact distinction, because sort of analysis and interpretation can sometimes go hand in hand, as you'll see, I think, from some of the examples that I gave. So I'm going to talk about following a thread. Interestingly, we don't see this one used as often as some of the others, but I thought because for completeness, and it's something that I personally have used, I thought I would run through a quick example of this, which is where you do an initial analysis of kind of each of your components, quant and qual, and you identify one of the key themes that is running through, and then essentially you follow that through the quant and qual data to see what insights you can gain from that. So hopefully when I talk you through an example, it'll make some sense. So this one's quite old now, and it's often an example that's cited in the literature as an example of following a thread. And it's quite interesting because when I did it, I didn't realize I was following a thread. I just did it, and then somebody told me later I was following a thread. So kind of, which I think gives you, sort of scope that in mixed methods you can do something that feels right and has a methodological rigor, but they might not have a label to sort of call it at the time. I'm trying not to get too caught up with what the actual data is saying. It's more just the example of the methods I'm trying to get across here. But in order to do that, I've got to tell you some information about the data, if you see what I mean. So don't get too tied up in the actual, in the actual research findings. But we're doing a study to look at socio-demographic patterning of health seeking. We had qual and quant data that was collected in parallel. There was no dominance in either of the methods, and we did this integration at the analysis stage. So I had qualitative interviews and a primary care led survey of patients from different socioeconomic backgrounds. So just to remind you, what you do here then is you've done your preliminary analysis and you're trying to find a theme. Okay, so in this case then, we're trying to say, okay, the qualitative research has come up with hypotheses that we can test in the quantitative data. Then we can run that quantitative hypothesis testing, but then we can go back to the qualitative work to look at how we interpret the findings from that. And then that is cyclical. So you can go on as many phases of that as you like. In this case, we sort of had 2 phases. And that's the gist of it anyway. So when I ran this analysis, one of the real emergent themes from the qualitative work was that our participants had strong views about what constituted appropriate use of healthcare services. I mean, we've seen from COVID, I think people in the UK have a strong sense of ownership over the NHS. It's something that they kind of hold dearly, and they feel like it's only fair to take what you need from it and leave the rest for other people. And that feeling came across really strongly, that there's a sense of sort of self-rationing. I'm only going to use it when I really need it, and I'm certainly not going to waste it, and I'm not going to bother people with things that I would consider sort of insignificant. So that was a strong theme that came through. So I thought, okay, well, we'll take that and we'll turn that into a hypothesis. So we can say, okay, those people who agree with the statement quantitatively that people use services inappropriately would be less likely to report that they would seek care for some standardized symptoms. So that was the hypothesis that we set up. So we presented the people in the survey with some symptom vignettes, one of which was a kind of a symptom around a chest pain. We kept it really vague, so it could be chest pain, it could have been indigestion, it could have been something that was very self-limiting, to give sort of room for interpretation, essentially. So we had as our main explanatory variable in this analysis that people would use services inappropriately, that they strongly agreed with that statement, and the main outcome was that they would seek immediate care for the chest pain scenario. So I've said the hypothesis already. People who think that people use services inappropriately would be less likely to report immediate help seeking for standardized symptoms. We found reflected in the survey, similarly to what we'd found in the qualitative work, that a lot of people did agree with the fact that people use services inappropriately. That 65%, in fact, agreed with that statement. However, when we looked at that as a predictor of who would seek care for a standard set of symptoms, then actually we didn't see the relationship that we would have expected. I'll just put this up for completeness, but don't worry if you're not familiar with it. These are odds ratios, and here we were expecting to see a difference between the two groups. But as you can see, because these odds ratios weren't that different from one, that actually the null hypothesis was confirmed. And our confidence intervals included 1, so we didn't see any evidence of that relationship. So then we went back to people and sort of said, okay, kind of like, what can we find out from the qualitative data that might explain this? And this finding that was at odds with the hypothesis we set up from the first qualitative analysis. And here we found the theme othering, that participants tend not to discuss times when they've used services inappropriately. It's other people do this, not them. Other people don't go through the same rational decision making that they do, and that it's sort of they've got good ideas in their own head and good rationalizations for when they seek care for what may seem to other people trivial decisions. Sort of, however, they've made a decision rationally, and it tends to be about the fact of whether they're worried or not. And that comes from a whole range of things like family history, previous experience of conditions, etc., etc. So that if you've got anxiety, you will go, despite whatever your views are about whether people use care inappropriately or not. And so I just had an example here where somebody was talking about somebody turning up to ED with a sore throat. God, you know, with a sore throat, only had a sore throat, I wouldn't stand for people like that. But then we had another participant that talked through a scenario fairly recently where her husband went to A&E for a sore throat, and kind of and felt fully justified in this decision because, as you'll see from the quote, well, it turned out it hadn't gone away by itself and it was tonsillitis, and so they felt that meant that was fully justified. So then we sort of went back then from this and generated another hypothesis that reported anxiety relating to the system would be a predictor of immediate care seeking, which is what that sort of qualitative data would suggest. And when we looked at that, we did find that self-perceived anxiety was a strong predictor of care seeking. So here, those that were anxious were 7 times or over 7 times more likely to say they would seek immediate care than those that weren't. Now, again, it's not about the actual, you know, sort of data points and what the message of the research is. It's about the hypothesis generation, the testing, the explanation, the further generation of hypotheses, and then the testing is the point that I want to get across in this sort of idea of following the thread. Okay, so one of the other techniques that you'll probably see quite often is that around a mixed methods matrix. And essentially, this is when we kind of talk about, we try and bring together the qual and quantitative data on a case-by-case basis though, rather than on a sort of methodological basis where you've got quant over here and qual over here. You've got it on individuals as cases, or it might not be individuals, it may be case studies for argument's sake, but it's a case of some form or other. Where you've got essentially you have a row in your table or matrix, whatever, however fancy you want to call it, and then the columns are the different data points. And so you can use that to help to look for patterns between and across data. So I'm going to give you an example that I found recently. I've actually got the references at the end here, so don't worry about that if you want to look up any of these studies afterwards. So it was a study around child welfare inequalities, and the study was looking at the relationship between area level deprivation and child protection interventions, and how they tried to bring the data points together was in a mixed method matrix, but they essentially used what they called was a sort of an adaptation of a framework analysis. Now, I'm sure most of you are familiar with the framework analysis from qualitative methods, and it was just sort of an expansion of that to try and pull quant and qual data into that matrix, or that framework, if you like, to see if insights could be gained from that. So they had transcripts and they had codes, that inductive codes, as well as codes that came from the research question. I mean, in framework analysis, we're mostly expecting them to come from the research questions, but there's normally scope to include inductive questions as well. and they had quantitative data on things like, rates of contacts with services, referral rates, expenditure, etc. And so they were both organised into this framework approach. So that's just a slide to confirm the kinds of data that they had, kind of quant and qual. And then this is the matrix that they developed. So here is it's just a blank matrix just to give you an idea. But you'll see here they had a case study site and various local authorities that they had selected using quantitative information actually on analysis of, sort of deprivation rates, etc. And so for each of these case study sites and the local authorities, they had all the data points relating to that site across the top. So you can see how that matrix develops. And I've included the code and framework just so you can see that this sort of like P1 code here relates to there, etc. Just so you can see then they try to start to populate that with the data. And they did this, I think, sort of very nicely. And so I've just got an example here of one that they give to show how they did that. Again, I'm not trying to get too caught up with actually what the data is trying to show. It's just to give you an example of how they put the data together in the methods. So this is a sort of this is a detailed view of this one particular cell, where they've presented the data sort of quantitatively across deprivation tertiles around sort of the expenditure, and here the black line represented the particular case study, as opposed to the data for all of the, kind of the background data, if you like. So they had that data, and then they also had data from some of their qualitative work. And then interestingly, this is where they've put down from that, how they've developed a meta-inference, which they've tried to sort of say is around patterns of expenditure are related to workload pressures, and that they've only managed to sort of discover that, if you like, because they've put these two data together and then been able to show that relationship. So it's just a sort of another example of how you might think about displaying that sort of data to try and make those inferences. And of course, sometimes you've got to take sort of a leap of faith, because sometimes you might do some sort of data displays like this, and actually you can't, and there isn't anything to spot, but so I suppose it's just whether it's just going through the process and seeing if that helps you to discover these, kind of additional insights. So another example of a joint display method. I mean, a lot of these methods are just about ways of putting the data together, which are going to help you discover patterns in the data, which you might want to sort of pull out. So one of these is the pillar integration process. It can be used at the analysis or the interpretation stage. And the example that I've got in the paper that I've given you, it was used for primary data as well as secondary data. And I thought it was quite useful, because sometimes you want to do a mixed methods systematic review, for argument's sake, rather than using primary data. And this was a nice example of how they had pulled the data together using this, this data display process. So essentially, they set it out on a sheet of paper like this, and they start off with one of the types of data. It can be either, and you essentially list out the key important sort of descriptive findings that you have from that data. You list out them from one side of the methods if you want. And then essentially you go through the process of matching, whether you think for each of the data points you've got, for argument's sake, on the quantitative list, whether you think you've got a matching qualitative point or not. And then you would list that, and you'd put your matching points sort of in parallel, so you can see where they match each other. And so that you can see how that process, you're starting to think, oh, actually, where are the gaps? Where are they? Where is it similar? Where are the findings different? And then once you've been through that and sort of double checked it and made sure you've got your categorizations right, and that you're sure that there's no other matches that you haven't picked up on, you then start to think about building these pillars, which are down the middle, the insights which can be gained looking across all of the data together on a particular sort of point that you've noted down. It probably is easier if I just show you an example. So here's one that they have from their paper, where here they've got, this was a wellbeing mentor intervention they were looking at. So here they've got some basic descriptive quantitative data. They've categorized that, and they've listed out all the quantitative data on one side. And then they go through and they've listed out any matching qualitative data from the other. And you'll see here, sometimes there's a gap, kind of there's a gap there where there isn't any quantitative data on that point, and that's perfectly normal. And then down sort of the middle is where they've tried to build sort of their higher order themes. So again, that's just another example of how you might want to think about displaying your data. So finally, kind of, I'll just talk about a triangulation protocol. I'll talk about it briefly, but I just wanted to make sort of a separate note around the fact that in a lot of these, certainly the last one and this one, you're looking to put the data types together, and you're looking for agreement, less agreement where there's a silence, where there's dissonance between the data points, and that's one of the things that you're specifically looking for to see if that can gain you any insights from looking at the two data points together. But I want to just give you a really brief example of this from a project that I'm just finishing up, which was looking at an evaluation of general practitioners working in emergency departments. We looked at each component, it was analysed separately, and then we've tried to display that together. But we did this sort of based on a theoretical framework. And I just wanted to have one extra example in here, whereas the ones I've mentioned so far have tended to be fairly iterative or sort of come out of the research questions, whereas this time we used a theoretical framework as our matrix, if you like, and then put the data into it according to whether we thought it matched or didn't match, or where the gaps were, if that makes sense. Because I think a lot of the time you might see papers that do that, so I just wanted to include an example. So here we've got our quantitative analysis, which came from HES data and a survey that we did, and our qualitative analysis that came from 10 case sites using observation and interviews. We did this higher level synthesis, and we mapped our study findings onto the constructs of NPT. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but kind of, if for those who aren't, it's an implementation theory, and it's called normalization process theory. And so we were using those concepts and mapped our data onto that in our matrix to see, kind of what insights we could gain. So here I've just put one of the constructs of NPT is to basically assess whether people are committed to using this model, which is GPED model that I've talked about, and what are the factors that might promote that. And as you'll see, we've drawn on qual and quant data to try and populate that conceptual model as a way of integrating the data. Okay. So one of the final points I want to make then is something around sort of like quality criteria for mixed methods research. And I kind of thought I could read these out, or I could let sort of like Alicia speak for herself. So I'm going to try the technically challenging thing of playing a video. So bear with me in case this doesn't work, but but I'm going to have a go anyway. Is that working all right?
Yeah.
We need to pay attention to how we report our mixed method studies so that researchers reading our papers and reports can assess the quality of the work that we've done. To this end, Okahorn and colleagues in 2008 produced some guidance to help researchers report their studies well. It's called Good Reporting of a Mixed Method Study, or GRAMS. There are 6 items in GRAMS. The first item is about justifying the reason why you have used mixed methods research. The second item is about describing clearly the mixed methods design you have used. The third item is giving detail about the sampling, data collection and analysis of both the qualitative and quantitative components of your study. The fourth item is about integration of the qualitative and quantitative components, both how you have integrated and who has been involved in that integration. The fifth item is recognising that sometimes in mixed method studies, by combining a number of methods, one of those methods may have had some limitations because we may have lacked the resources to do all the methods to the high standard that we might have wanted. And we need to be clear about whether this occurred in mixed method study. And then finally, it's good to be explicit about any insights that have been generated from integration within your mixed method study. Just to go back to the reason why we want GRAMS, because we want to report our mixed method studies in a very clear way so that other researchers can judge the quality of the research we've done.
I just wanted to finish off just by, I guess, sort of paying some service to the fact that, you know, kind of we conduct our research within, you know, kind of within our teams and with our departments and funded by particular organisations. And I kind of think sometimes that can sort of make mixed methods a bit more difficult, you know, kind of as Alicia was just saying in the video, kind of sometimes it can be hard if you have to do a qual and a quant component, you have to explain that fully, you have to talk through sort of like the rigour in both of those methods, as well as any additional rigour from the mixed methods components. And when you're trying to write that up for publication in say, a, you know, 3,000 word paper, it can be quite tricky. And when you're working on a multidisciplinary team, you know, kind of sometimes that mixed method work, unless somebody's got the skill set for it or is in charge of it, can be quite difficult, because then, you know, kind of if you think about the sort of people's research careers, who then gets first authorship on a mixed methods paper, if it's, you know, sort of a balanced study. And so I suppose it's just some of those kind of issues I just wanted people to think about. Not everyone has the skills to do mixed method integration. How do you sort of factor that into your team, and how do you factor in the time that it might take to do the mixed methods component over and above your sort of qual and quant individually? So I just wanted to kind of leave at that point and hopefully open that up for discussion and questions that anyone might have. I'd like to, you know, very much hear about your experiences as well.
Thanks, Joy. Would you mind stop sharing your screen? That'd be great.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. A really interesting, informative and thought-provoking presentation. And I really liked those very clear examples you shared about how we can integrate those different data sources into a single analysis and bring it together and look across it in so we've got some time for questions. If people want to pop questions in the chat box, or just put your name in the chat box, and I will come to you and invite you to ask your question to Joy.
I just want to, I don't know if I said already, I have got the references on another slide in case anybody wants to look up any of the papers that I've mentioned. Yeah,
that would be really useful. I've got a question, Joy, about the presenter in that short video clip talked about the importance of conveying your research design in a clear and transparent way to other researchers. Do you have any thoughts or tips about how we convey that to other audiences? So I'm thinking people in healthcare and social care professional roles.
Oh, sorry, Paul, just as you were saying the crucial bit, your voice.
Oh, okay, so I moved my hand. I think I might put it over the mic. I'll keep my hand still. I was thinking about how do we convey the research design, the mixed method design, in a clear and transparent way to other non-research audiences. I'm thinking, for example, policymakers or people in practice, in healthcare or social care practice.
Ooh. I mean, I think that's a tough one. I think that's a tough one, because I think we have that, whether we're using quantitative or qualitative alone, actually, let alone mixed methods, because, and I think with mixed methods, everything always feels a bit exaggerated, because you've got to somehow then explain more than one thing, and then, you know, so it's almost like three things you have to explain. I'm not sure I have an easy answer to that in terms, you know, kind of, I think it's, and I think it's very tricky. I suppose it depends on I suppose the important thing that we're trying to convey a lot of the time is that we've done something with rigor, you know, kind of, I mean, it's how much of the detail sort of people need to know about, because I think sometimes I know as a kind of nerdy methodologist, I can get, you know, kind of like end up getting really excited about the methods, whereas actually I think a lot of the time, for some of the audiences that they've mentioned, they're more interested in the results and what the implications of those might be. So I think sometimes in terms of those audiences, I think less can sometimes be more around the methods, actually, of almost sort of finding that way to convey that something's been done in a reflexive and a thoughtful and a rigorous way, but without, you know, sort of too much detail, because I think sometimes certain audiences just don't find that interesting, or, you know, kind of it's not the key message they want to take away, basically, I think.
Yeah, I think good message, less is more.
Mm-hmm.
So Yvonne, do you want to ask your question? Do you want to switch your mic on and ask your question?
Yeah, Joy, I was just wondering what you think the biggest misunderstanding people have in terms of performing a sort of integration in the analysis. What do you think is the biggest misunderstanding people have?
Well, I think it's tricky, because there's lots of debate about it, and I sort of, I suppose I'm not sure whether we would say there's sort of a definitive answer about what, kind of what that integration should look like. I mean, I think the biggest misunderstanding is about that actually there isn't really any integration, and I think sometimes, and I suppose you're in that sort of discussion, like, is it enough to sort of do your two separate pieces of work and just discuss them in the light of each other? Sort of, is that integration? And I suppose in my mind that would probably be the start of an integration, but I think I probably would like to see something done more formally, so that you've been systematic with it, rather than thinking, oh yeah, well, this was the quant, and we had some qualitative bit over there that spoke to that. And I think that might just end up, you might just then pick out some of the key bits if you're using it in a discussion way, rather than thinking, actually, I want to try and do that more systematically. And I think because we've got these, I mean, it's not, I mean, kind of, I think sometimes the terminology is worse than the actual thing, because, mostly we just mean putting stuff in a table next to each other to see if it sort of matches or doesn't match, and what we can learn from that. So, I think it's sort of, you can call it a, kind of whatever you want, a pillar or whatever, but essentially it's just, it's essentially sort of plain snap, kind of like in a, kind of in a way, yeah.
We've got a question here. I'll read it out from the chat box. How does integration relate to or differ from abduction? And you might have to help me out here in explaining what meant by abduction as well.
Whoever asked the question is going to have to help me out actually by what they mean by that. Yeah.
Perhaps the person who posed the question, would you like to switch your mic on it and convey that question in person?
Yeah, hi. So I think what I was getting at was that, well, I'm not got a great understanding of abduction, but I think it's that process of going from inductively what the data goes from perhaps deductively, so coming from a theoretical perspective. I suppose that's the process, and you've kind of outlined ways you might deal with that through the various strategies, but maybe that's what I was getting at, really, rather, how it might differ. I just wanted to have a perspective on that, whether my understanding was correct.
Oh, I'm not sure I'm going to be able to give you any massive insight into that. I mean, I kind of think, I suppose, I mean, certainly that last, piece of work we did where we tried to sort of think about, if I'm understanding this correctly, I think there's a sort of a combination between, you've always, often you've got a theoretical sort of model that you're interested in, and it may be from the start, or it may be that you bring it in sort of, kind of towards the end, depending on what it is we're trying to do, what we're trying to look through a different lens at the end. And I kind of think it's almost about sort of, it's just about making sure you're thorough. So when we were putting, kind of our concepts in sort of in framework, of course, some things don't fit under that, and that doesn't make them any less valid. And something, sort of, some things fit in different ways. And I just think it's about trying to sort of convey that whole story across. But I think sometimes that can be very difficult, especially, kind of in word counts that you have, kind of to actually really talk about the difference between what's been inductive and, sort of, and what's based on models. And it always seems to me like a combination of that, really. I'm not sure I've been particularly helpful there.
Thanks, Joy. There's a question from Emily Liness. Emily, if you're there, would you like to ask your question to Joy?
Thank you very much for a really helpful and interesting talk. I was just wondering if you would recommend any particular formal training in mixed methods. So, for example, I have some training in qualitative methods and some experience in quantitative methods. Is that sufficient, or should I really be looking to get some more formal training?
Oh gosh, it's quite, I mean, that's quite hard. I mean, kind of, as far as I know it, I can't think of any formal training that would be specifically in mixed methods that I could recommend. I know the guys in the US, you know, kind of the certainly Cresswell and his posse, they do specific courses in it. Now I don't know if it's sort of they're available online or not, and I think that can be quite tricky. I mean, I sort of think, as a sort of coming from the point of view of being a mixed methods researcher and doing that integration, I think sort of I use more of my qualitative skills in that than I use my quantitative skills, because often it is about that sort of, you know, as in the example that I showed around using a sort of essentially an adapted framework analysis. I think as long as you sort of understand, you know, kind of depending on what you're trying to do, of course, but as long as you're understanding what the outputs of the quantitative research mean, and, you know, kind of and what that, you know, what that finding is, then how that matches with the qualitative stuff, I sort of think, well, it's, you know, kind of, I find that a qualitative skill rather than a particularly quantitative skill. And so I find that mixed methods analysis more akin to a qualitative analysis. But of course, it depends, you know, if you're doing something like the following a thread and you want to set up a hypothesis and then test it, obviously it can be helpful if you can do that yourself, just because it's quicker. But if we have to then ask another team member to do that, it can be more tricky. But I kind of think, I suppose, having the training in the both, which, you know, kind of I have, I don't know if that's made me sort of any sort of better at the mixed methods angle, but like I say, I think if anything, I think it's the qualitative skills that I use in the mixed methods more than the quant.
Thank you.
Thanks, Emily. Thanks, Joy. That's all the questions, and we're just about out of time. I wonder, Joy, whether you had any kind of final encouraging words for researchers and research students who are just about to embark on their first mixed methods study.
Oh, I just think it's about being brave and having a go. I mean, you know, there are lots of text around now that, you know, kind of, and I certainly would recommend looking at that Journal of Mixed Methods Research, because I mean, that has, you know, quite a lot of good methodological examples of things you can try and that you can use to sort of, you know, display your data and start to look for those patterns. So I kind of think it would just be about sort of being brave and, you know, kind of, and just because something hasn't got a name already doesn't mean to say it's not a legitimate way of doing something. So, and I think sometimes what can be obvious, intuitive to you and obvious, as long as you're doing that systematically, you know, kind of, it's normally a legitimate way of approaching it. So kind of, so I just say, you know, kind of, yeah, have a look at some of the literature then, but have a look at your own examples and see what jumps out at you as an obvious way to try and think about exploring that integration work.
Thank you, Joy. Thank you for a really insightful and very practical presentation too. You've highlighted some really concrete examples and approaches to doing mixed methods research successfully. I really appreciate you bringing your experience to this webinar today. So a very big thank you. And you can see lots of thank yous coming through the chat box there as well. Great. There was a comment about accessing the PowerPoint slides. I know that Angie and the school are going to make this recording available on the SSCR website following this presentation, so people can go back to those references and have a look at those models again and different examples. And just to say that we have another webinar next week focusing on mental health. That's next Tuesday, the 8th of December. I'm just going to copy the Eventbrite link, and there are a number of presenters focusing on mental health from different projects, including another speaker from the University of York. It's all happening up in York, obviously, at the moment. So people may want to register for that webinar as well. Another big thank you, Joy, and thanks to everybody for joining us today. And I hope everybody has a good rest of the day.